Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
SoundCartel.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. The foundation of good business practice is based on trust and healthy relationships with suppliers, clients and staff. But a good business relationship is no substitute for a signed contract. Ryan Solomons is head of legal at Vault Legal. And because he's seen it all, he knows that a detailed and signed contract will save time, money and angst should things fall apart in the future. People do still enter handshake agreements, but as Ryan tells Chris Ashmore, they're far less common than a generation ago.
They're less common, and they're less common because there's a large body of case law that indicates that it's not a good idea to enter into a handshake agreement. Even with a written contract, there's still a level of trust between the parties because you might have a very good agreement that mitigates your risk, but ultimately, if you have to go to court to enforce that agreement, it's inherently risky and expensive. So it's best to avoid. So there's still that level of trust there. But look, ultimately, a written agreement builds trust. It builds trust because each party sets out their expectations and their obligations clearly.
Well, I guess like most lawyers, you're not a fan of handshakes. Can you go into detail why not?
Well, look, our job as lawyers is to mitigate risk. And a handshake agreement exposes a party to significant risk and uncertainty. You know, when it comes to a contract, what services are being provided? What goods are being provided? What is the price? What are the payment terms? Who's responsible for loss or damage? Who's responsible for delivery and replacement? These are unknowns if you have a handshake agreement. So it's really important that parties outline the terms and conditions of a contract in writing.
Do you have any examples of when a handshake agreement has gone pear-shaped?
Yeah, look, we acted for a client once who bought into a business without actually having a written agreement. And unfortunately, that business went bankrupt shortly thereafter. And that person didn't have a lot of redress against the individual who they purchased the shares on because they didn't provide any warranties as to the financial viability of the company, what assets and liabilities the company had. So when the company went belly up, ultimately, well, the other side just said, well, you bought the business as is.
Well, you have 5 reasons to support documenting handshakes. If we can go through each one, the first you have is accountability.
First accountability. It creates certainty for parties by detailing expectations and deliverables and where goods are to be supplied, timeframes for delivery, payment terms, and the quality of the goods.
The second is no surprises.
I think it's really important to avoid any misunderstandings in an agreement. If everything's detailed in writing, you're less likely to disagree. Also, if everything's detailed in writing, it then addresses all the potential arrangements that can occur. And finally, if someone doesn't put something in writing, they don't agree to a written contract, that's a red flag not to enter into business with that person.
Well, the third tip is enforcement.
Yeah, look, as I alluded to before, it can be difficult, time-consuming and extremely costly to establish each party's rights and obligations under an oral contract. And therefore, courts are reluctant to enforce the terms of oral contracts, especially where the terms are incomplete or are unclear. You know, it comes down to a he said, she said argument. But if it's in writing, it's very clear. The evidence is there as to what the parties agreed on, the price, the payment terms, what was to be delivered, when it was to be delivered. If that's verbal, all the court can rely on is what the party said, which may not be reliable.
Number 4 is confidentiality.
Yeah, look, sometimes it's unclear in a contract or in a commercial arrangement between parties what is confidential and what is not, and what exceptions are there for the disclosure of information. So a contract clearly sets out what information each party considers to be confidential and in what circumstances they can disclose that confidential information.
And the 5th reason to supporting documentation is getting out of a hairy situation.
Yeah, that's right. Look, without a written contract, the only real step parties have is to go straight to litigation. But in a written contract, you can put alternative dispute resolution clauses in there that require the parties to try to resolve it through dispute resolution mediation before they're required to go to court to enforce their rights. This can be a process that is much more cost-effective than going straight to litigation. Also, it can actually salvage the parties' relationship. If you go to litigation, then any opportunity for an ongoing relationship is ultimately destroyed because it's an adversarial process, whereas alternative dispute resolution like mediation, conciliation, arbitration, they create the ability for the parties to continue to actually work together if they resolve their differences amicably.
What should be the bare minimum included on a contract or even a memorandum of understanding?
Well, look, I think the main terms a contract should have, or a memorandum of understanding, is description of the goods or services, the supplier's obligations, the customer's obligations, price and payment terms, warranties and representations around what they're supplying, confidentiality and intellectual property terms as to who owns the intellectual property developed during the course of the contract, indemnities and liability provisions, termination provisions, permitting each party to terminate the contract for convenience or upon a breach by one party, dispute resolution clauses like I referred to earlier, force majeure provisions. Force majeure is the act of God, a situation outside of the control of the parties that causes the contract to be unenforceable. One party cannot perform its obligations under the contract because of an act of God, fire, flood, terrorism, so forth, as well as the typical boilerplate clauses that you put in contracts around, cannot be varied or signed without the consent of both parties in writing. These are the type of provisions that should be put as a minimum, that should be put in a contract between parties. Also, it's very important that contracts be drafted clearly, in detail and unambiguously, so that if there is a future dispute, it can be resolved quickly and amicably because the terms are known with certainty.
That was Ryan Solomons, Head of Legal at Bolt Legal. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.